What if the very fabric of our moral judgments, from our deepest instincts right up to our grandest societal laws, is actually driven by a single underlying principle?
Hmm,
It sounds almost too simple for something as complex as human morality, doesn't it?
it really does.
But that's exactly the profound question we're diving into today.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to unpack an incredibly insightful AI-driven study. It's titled Consequentialism, Humanity's Moral Operating System.
Okay.
And this research, it presents a truly unifying thesis
Mm-hmm.
that human morality, when you look at it as a complex adaptive system, is fundamentally driven by consequentialism.
Consequentialism.
Simply put, it's the idea that the true value of an action or a rule or even a personal trait, well, it's determined by its outcomes, by its consequences.
Right. And for you, our listener, this deep dive is going to offer a powerful shortcut to understanding this idea. We're moving beyond maybe abstract philosophy to a more scientific explanation of why we act the way we do and what truly shapes our moral landscape. You'll gain some genuinely surprising insights into cooperation, conflict, how kids develop, leadership, even the future of AI, all through this lens of consequences. Ultimately, this is about making sense of our moral universe and understanding how we can consciously, shape a better future. Let's dig in.
So let's start at the very beginning. What exactly is consequentialism?
Good question.
At its core, it's really a family of ethical theories where the rightness or wrongness of any action is based solely on its outcomes.
Okay, solely outcomes.
From this viewpoint, a morally right act is simply the one that produces the best available outcome. It's inherently teleological, which is just a fancy way of saying it's goal-oriented.
Goal-oriented. Makes sense.
It's all about making the future best, whether that means aiming for more pleasure, happiness, overall well-being, or maybe satisfying people's desires.
I like that, making the future best. We certainly can't change the past. And it comes in a few different flavors, right? Like act consequentialism, where you judge each individual choice.
Precisely. Act consequentialism is the most direct. It says the morally right action in any given situation is the one that produces the best overall consequences.
Any given situation.
Yeah. Imagine you're hiding an innocent person from an attacker. Act consequentialism would say lying to the attacker is morally right in that specific moment because, well, it saves a life.
Right.
The general rule, do not lie, is usually useful, sure. But if breaking it leads to a significantly better result in that one instance, you break it.
So breaking a rule for a better immediate outcome, that makes a certain kind of intuitive sense. But then there's also rule consequentialism, which feels a bit different, maybe more structured.
It definitely takes a step back.
Right.
Rule consequentialism argues that a morally right action is one that conforms to a set of rules. But here's the twist.
Yeah.
The general acceptance or observance of those rules is what would produce the best consequences over the long term for society.
Okay. The general acceptance.
Exactly. So not speeding on an empty highway at 2 a.m. isn't really about that one isolated instance. It's about upholding the general rule against speeding, because that rule, when followed by most people most of the time, saves far more lives overall and provides a stable framework for public safety.
And then the big one, the name everyone usually recognizes, utilitarianism.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the most famous example of a consequentialist theory, championed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Right, those names ring a bell.
Utilitarianism defines the good to be maximized as utility. Usually that means aggregate happiness or well-being, and also minimizing suffering. Its core principle is, the greatest good for the greatest number.
The classic formulation.
But it's important to remember that consequentialism is a broad church, While utilitarianism is prominent, there are other variants, like hedonism, which focuses just on maximizing pleasure, or preference utilitarianism, aiming to satisfy desires. You even have things like pluralistic consequentialism, which argues for promoting multiple intrinsic goods like knowledge, freedom, beauty, justice, not just pinning everything on one single value.
So despite those variations, they all share some fundamental DNA, I imagine, some core ideas.
They do. Two big ones. First, impartiality, meaning the happiness or suffering of any one individual counts equally, regardless of their status, wealth, whatever. Your happiness isn't inherently more important than mine or anyone else's.
Okay, impartiality. That's key.
And second, aggregationism, which is basically the idea that the overall value of an outcome is determined by summing up the values, the good and the bad, for all the individuals affected.
So you're adding it all up.
You're literally trying to add up the total benefit across everyone impacted by, say, building a new park, and weigh that against the total cost or suffering it might cause.
Okay, so that's consequentialism. How does it stack up against other major ethical frameworks out there, like deontology? I remember that being all about duties and rules.
That's a great contrast to draw. Consequentialism's laser focus on outcomes really sets it apart. Deontology, famously associated with Immanuel Kant,
Yeah.
says morality is about adhering to universal rules or duties. For a deontologist, some actions, like lying or killing an innocent person, are inherently wrong, period, regardless of the consequences.
So even if lying saves a life for a strict deontologist,
It's still morally wrong because it violates a universal duty of truthfulness. The positive outcome doesn't change the inherent wrongness of the act itself.
and virtue ethics, that's about character, isn't it? Like what kind of person you are.
Precisely. Virtue ethics, which has its roots in Aristotle's philosophy, shifts the focus entirely. It's not about actions or outcomes directly, but about the moral agent's character traits, like courage, honesty, compassion.
So the question becomes,
And ask, what would a virtuous person do? A virtuous person wouldn't necessarily follow a rigid rule or meticulously calculate an outcome. They'd act in a way that expresses their cultivated virtuous character in that situation.
it sounds like consequentialism offers a very practical, almost action-oriented approach to making the world better. Figure out what works and do that. But it also seems to have a pretty obvious Achilles heel.
Its strength is definitely its practicality, yeah. It offers impartial guidance for decision-making aimed squarely at improving the world. But you're absolutely right. Its main weakness, the big challenge, is that predicting all the consequences of an action can be incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, for us humans.
Yeah, I can see that.
And critics often point out it might, in theory, justify questionable actions. The classic concern that the end justifies the means.
This sounds less like abstract philosophy now and more like, well, a complex calculation, which brings us neatly to rationality, probability, and even game theory.
Indeed, consequentialism by its very nature transforms moral problems into optimization exercises. It really does.
Optimization exercises, like engineering.
In a way, yes. It's about identifying all the potential outcomes of an action, assigning some kind of value to each outcome, assessing the probability, the likelihood of each outcome actually happening.
Okay, so like expected value. Value times probability.
Exactly. That's the core idea.
Yeah.
And then aggregating these values across all the affected individuals to find the action with the highest total expected value.
Wow. That sounds like an impossibly complex calculation for a human brain to do on the fly, with all our biases and blind spots and limited information.
It often is, and that's a major criticism.
So I'm guessing that's where AI steps onto the stage.
That's where the implications get truly profound, yes. This practical impossibility for humans becomes a powerful possibility with AI.
How so?
The study suggests that an advanced AI, with its, vast data processing capacity and its potential for programmed impartiality, could act as that ideal neutral observer that philosophers have long hypothesized about.
The impartial calculator.
Precisely. This frames AI as a potential solution to consequentialism's historical weakness. It paints a picture of a future where humans define the good, the values we care about, and AI performs the incredibly complex, impartial consequence analysis to help us achieve it.
And this ties directly into game theory, too, which is also all about strategic interactions and consequences, right?
It absolutely does. Game theory is fundamentally consequentialist at its core. Each player, each agent, makes choices based on the expected consequences, which crucially depend on the choices of other players. It helps us model how conflict and cooperation emerge in complex systems. Take the classic prisoner's dilemma.
Always a good one.
Right. Two individuals acting purely in their own rational self-interest, trying to optimize their own outcome, end up with a worse collective outcome than if they had just cooperated.
The suboptimal result.
Exactly. Morality, viewed through this lens, functions as a system that effectively restructures the payoffs of the game. It makes cooperation the rational, consequence-optimizing strategy for everyone involved in the long run.
This raises an important and maybe slightly unsettling question. What's the default ethic of an AI, then, if it's designed purely to optimize something?
The source makes a really strong claim here, and it's worth pausing on. An AI is defined by its objective function.
Its goal.
Its goal, yeah.
Yeah.
A mathematical specification of a goal it's programmed to optimize. This function is essentially a formal representation of a good. And the AI's entire operation is a sophisticated process of calculating which actions will best maximize the value of that function.
So its very nature is.
Its native default ethic is inevitably a form of consequentialism. The crucial debate for AI ethics, then, isn't if AI will be consequentialist, it likely will be by design, but what consequences we program it to value and pursue. It's the fundamental challenge of value alignment making, absolutely sure its goals align with ours with human well-being.
Okay, let's unpack this even further. This idea that our morality is rooted in consequences isn't just about abstract philosophy or futuristic AI. The study argues it's deep in our biology, our very brains, and how we evolved. Our human brain isn't a blank slate, it's essentially a consequence evaluation engine.
That's a great way to put it. Modern neuroscience is revealing that our capacity for moral reasoning isn't some single monolithic function. It's an emergent property of multiple neural systems interacting, each sort of specialized for different aspects of consequence evaluation.
Like different parts doing different jobs.
Exactly. Take the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC.
Okay, the VMPFC.
It's a critical hub that integrates emotional signals with value-based decisions. What's fascinating is that damage to this area often leads to more quote-unquote utilitarian judgments. Meaning people are more likely to endorse harming one person to save five, like in the trolley problem scenarios. This suggests the VMPFC normally integrates the emotional cost of harm into the decision, making us hesitate, adding that gut feeling of wrongness.
So it's about feeling the consequences, not just rationally calculating them. And what about the amygdala? I know that's involved in emotion.
The amygdala acts as the brain's sort of early warning system. It provides rapid, visceral, emotional signals of aversion or wrongness, especially when direct harm to someone is involved. It gives us that immediate gut feeling, that strong sense of don't do that.
That quick, intuitive reaction.
Right. And then there's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. That sounds like the part that brings in the more abstract logical thinking.
The cool-headed calculator.
Kind of, yeah. The DLPFC is involved in more abstract reasoning and cognitive control. It's the part that allows us to override those initial powerful emotional responses from the amygdala and VMPFC, enabling a more calculated choice, the kind of deliberate decision-making needed for a full-blown consequentialist calculation, weighing pros and cons more objectively.
This brain architecture sounds like it sets up two different, sometimes competing ways of thinking about morality, a gut feeling versus a calculation.
It absolutely does. It strongly supports what's known as the dual process model of moral judgment.
Dual process, okay.
This model suggests our moral judgments arise from two competing systems. A fast, intuitive, emotional system involving the amygdala and VMPFC, which gives us those immediate gut reactions. These often align with deontological-like prohibitions, like harming people is just wrong.
That immediate no.
Exactly. And then there's a slow, deliberate, cognitive system associated more with the DLPFC, which performs more abstract, effortful, consequentialist calculations, weighing the outcomes. Think of the classic trolley problem.
Pull the lever or push the person.
Right. That's a perfect, almost visceral example of these two systems clashing within us. The emotional aversion to direct harm versus the calculated greater good.
So even though we have these somewhat hardwired instincts, consequential thinking isn't just automatic. It sounds like a skill we can actually develop, maybe even get better at.
It absolutely is. The study emphasizes this. It's a psychological skill that can be honed. It requires the ability to objectively analyze a situation, predict likely outcomes, understand complex cause and effect chains before acting. It's a blend of critical analysis and, crucially, emotional intelligence, pushing us beyond just reactive impulses towards considered intention, always asking, implicitly or explicitly, what is the best possible outcome here, all things considered, and how do I help bring that about?
Now, connecting this back to evolution, this is where it gets truly compelling for me. The idea that morality, fundamentally, is a form of cooperation, and it solves the evolutionary puzzle of altruism. How does nature, that blind, powerful, consequentialist algorithm of natural selection, figure out altruism? It's not obvious why one individual would sacrifice itself or its resources for another.
It does so through several really ingenious solutions, all based ultimately on consequences for survival and reproduction. The currency of evolution. The first is kin selection.
Kin selection, right, Hamilton's rule.
Famously described by W.D. Hamilton, yes. His rule, often simplified as RBC, explains that an altruistic gene can spread if the cost, C, to the individual carrying it is outweighed by the benefit, B, to relatives who likely also carry the gene, discounted by their degree of genetic relatedness.
So the closer the relative, the more likely the altruism pays off genetically.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You're evolutionarily incentivized more strongly to sacrifice resources or even risk yourself to save, say, 3 of your siblings, who share about 50% of your genes each, than 3 random strangers. It's a pure gene-level consequentialist calculation, ensuring shared genes make it into the next generation. The consequence is gene propagation.
Okay, so it's about optimizing for shared genetic consequences within families. But what about cooperation with people we're not related to? Friends, colleagues, strangers even. That seems like a whole other level of complexity.
That's where reciprocal altruism comes in. This is basically a tit-for-tat
You
strategy.
scratch my back.
I'll scratch yours later.
Yeah.
Exactly. An organism performs an altruistic act for another with the expectation based on past interactions or social cues that the favor will be returned in the future. It's a long-term consequentialist calculation. The benefit of having a reliable cooperative partner down the line outweighs the short-term cost of the initial helpful act. But this requires sophisticated cognitive machinery, memory to track who owes whom, the ability to recognize individuals, and crucially, the ability to detect and punish cheaters who take without giving back.
And this forms the basis for
very complex human emotions and social structures, things like friendship, gratitude, trust, reputation management, even righteous anger when someone violates the implicit contract.
And for humans, it's clearly not just about genes anymore, right? Culture plays this massive role in shaping our morality. How does that fit in?
It introduces a powerful new dynamic: gene-culture coevolution. Our unique capacity for high-fidelity social learning from others, led to the explosion of culture, a vast evolving pool of shared norms, beliefs, technologies, and practices. Now, groups that developed cooperative norms, think fairness, loyalty, truth-telling within the group, simply outcompeted other groups that didn't have those norms. They were more cohesive, better at collective action.
So culture created a new selection pressure.
Precisely. And this, in turn, favored genes that predisposed individuals to feel emotions like shame, guilt, empathy, because these traits had better consequences for thriving within these increasingly cooperative societies. Morality, then, emerges from this amazing feedback loop, where both our genes and our culture are constantly being shaped by their consequences for survival and flourishing.
This framework really helps us understand why humans often break the rules or act in ways that seem contradictory from a purely logical standpoint. It's not necessarily irrationality driving it.
Exactly. Many moral and political conflicts, think about nepotism or fierce in-group loyalty even when the group is wrong, are essentially optimization conflicts between different evolutionary levels or different timescales.
Optimization conflicts. Explain that.
Someone engaging in nepotism might be optimizing for ancient, narrowly scoped consequences, ensuring the success of their kin, which is a deep evolutionary drive from kin selection. But that action has negative consequences for the broader society, which relies on fairness and meritocracy.
So they're running an older program almost.
You could think of it that way. They're optimizing for perhaps kin-level benefits or maybe perceived tribal survival rather than the broader societal consequences that our modern laws and ethics aim for. It provides a powerful framework for understanding why we often act in ways that seem to contradict our stated moral principles. We're juggling multiple sets of consequences.
And as human societies grew much larger and more complex, those implicit, evolved rules probably weren't enough to maintain order, were they?
Definitely not.
That's where the social contract comes in, as a conscious, deliberate attempt to optimize consequences on a grand societal scale.
It's a monumental step in human collective consequentialism, absolutely. Social contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, they all use this thought experiment of a state of nature.
Right, life without government.
Exactly. A world without government, to highlight the catastrophic consequences they desperately wanted to avoid. Hobbes famously imagined a war of all against all, where life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Not appealing.
Not at all. Locke saw insecure rights and endless conflict over property. Rousseau envisioned a limited, perhaps even stagnant, natural liberty. These aren't descriptions of paradise. They're descriptions of the devastating outcomes that the social contract explicitly aims to prevent.
So the contract itself is essentially a rational agreement among people, or at least an implicit one, to avoid those disastrous outcomes. It's a collective consequence management system.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a collective calculation. Surrendering some individual freedoms to a governing body leads to far better consequences for almost everyone. Things like security, order, justice, the ability to plan for the future.
And the legitimacy of the state
Comes directly from its ability to reliably produce these beneficial outcomes for the people who consent, implicitly or explicitly, to be governed by it. If it fails to deliver those good consequences, its legitimacy erodes.
And it seems like different social contract theories reflect different calculations about what the best consequences actually are, or maybe which consequences to prioritize.
They absolutely do. Hobbes, writing during the English Civil War, calculated that security and avoiding chaos were paramount. That justified, for him, an almost absolute sovereign power.
Safety first.
Pretty much. Locke, on the other hand, sought a more delicate balance between security and liberty. He argued government's primary job was to protect natural rights, life, liberty, property. And crucially, he included a right to revolution if the government became tyrannical and produced bad consequences.
A check on power.
Yes. And Rousseau focused more on the general will and the collective good. For him, surrendering individual rights to the community as a whole leads to a higher form of civil liberty and collective flourishing. Different equations, different optimal outcomes.
So how does this grand idea of the social contract actually tie back to our biological roots, to kin selection and reciprocity? Where do these two seemingly separate ideas, evolution and political philosophy, meet?
It's a fantastic connection, and the study suggests they aren't separate at all. The law of nature that Locke and others invoked, things like fairness, keeping promises, respecting property, can be seen as the bedrock principles and make cooperation possible, the very things favored by reciprocal altruism and maybe even gene culture coevolution. They are, in essence, evolutionarily selected, consequence-optimizing behavioral heuristics.
So the instincts that allow cooperation.
Exactly. The social contract, then, isn't some invention out of thin air. It's the conscious scaling up and institutionalization of this pre-existing, evolutionarily derived consequentialist logic. It formalizes fairness, reciprocity, and dispute resolution into law and governance for a complex, large-scale society. It elegantly unifies the biological and philosophical explanations under one powerful framework, optimizing consequences.
Okay, to really grasp how all these pieces fit together, evolution, psychology, social contracts, we really need to view human society itself as a complex adaptive system. You mentioned that earlier. It's constantly changing, everything's tightly coupled, it's governed by feedback loops, nonlinear, and often incredibly counterintuitive.
Yes, exactly.
Which means simple linear thinking, if I do A, then B will happen, often leads to unintended, sometimes negative, consequences down the line. C happens, D happens.
You've hit on the core challenge of managing any complex system, especially society. That's why we need a more sophisticated analytical toolkit. Causal loop diagrams, or CLDs, are incredibly useful here.
CLDs, okay.
They're basically visual maps of cause and effect relationships and, crucially, feedback loops. They help us see how the consequences of an action can circle back and influence the original situation or other parts of the system.
Like ripples in a pond, but they come back.
Exactly. Think about how trust in a community can lead to more cooperation, which in turn builds more trust. That's a reinforcing loop, a virtuous cycle. It snowballs.
Or the opposite?
Or, inversely, a vicious cycle. Think how poverty might lead to poor health, which reduces someone's ability to work, which then deepens their poverty. These loops amplify effects over time. We also see balancing loops, which try to maintain stability like a thermostat.
And network theory also sounds like a powerful tool for understanding these societal structures and connections.
It absolutely is. Network theory models society as nodes people, organizations, ideas, and edges the relationships or flows connecting them. For instance, understanding the difference between strong ties, like close family and friends who you interact with a lot, and weak ties, like acquaintances you see less often, is crucial.
Why's that?
Well, strong ties provide emotional support. But weak ties, surprisingly, are often much better for finding new information or opportunities, like a job, because they connect you to entirely different social circles. Understanding these network structures helps us see how information, influence, and even diseases spread.
Okay, so using CLDs and network theory helps model the system. Now let's bring this down to the individual level within that system, specifically thinking about the family unit and child development. I'm curious, based on this consequentialist lens, what would be the best possible scenario, the best environment to create a healthy, educated, and, well, good child?
That's a great practical question. From a consequentialist perspective, the best scenario is really about cultivating a skilled consequentialist reasoner in the child.
A skilled consequentialist reasoner,
Meaning someone who learns to accurately predict the likely consequences of their actions, not just for themselves, but for others too, and then consciously chooses behaviors that lead towards positive, cooperative, and beneficial outcomes. They internalize the connection between actions and results.
So we can actually look at different parenting styles as distinct strategies, maybe conscious or unconscious, for teaching this consequentialist logic with potentially wildly different results for the child.
Precisely. The research on parenting styles maps onto this framework remarkably well. Let's start with authoritarian parenting. The rigid ruler, high demandingness, low responsiveness approach.
Right, lots of rules, not much warmth. Because I said so.
Exactly. The core lesson here is a very primitive form of consequentialism. The consequence of breaking my rule is punishment, so obey the rule to avoid punishment. It fails to teach the why behind the rules, the broader consequences.
So the outcome is?
Children might be obedient out of fear, sure, but they often struggle to develop their own internal moral compass or self-discipline. They may have lower self-esteem, difficulty making independent decisions later in life. The long-term consequence can be either a follower mentality, always looking for external rules, or deep resentment and rebellion.
Okay. And then permissive parenting, which sounds like the polar opposite. Low rules, lots of warmth.
That's right. Low demandingness, high responsiveness. The parent acts more like a friend, avoids confrontation, wants to be liked, and often shields the child from experiencing negative consequences of their actions.
Oh, that sounds problematic.
It unfortunately often is, because it severs that crucial link between action and outcome. If you never experience the natural negative consequence of, say, not doing your homework, you don't learn self-regulation. Children raised this way often develop poor emotional control, lack persistence, have difficulty with boundaries, and can be more prone to risky behaviors because they haven't properly learned to internalize cause and effect.
And then neglectful or uninvolved parenting sounds like the worst of all worlds, lacking both rules and warmth.
It truly is. Low in both demandingness and responsiveness. The child is essentially left to figure out consequences entirely on their own in a harsh, unsupported world. This consistently produces the worst developmental outcomes: higher rates of depression, anxiety, academic failure, failed relationships, substance abuse, and delinquency. There's simply no guidance, no one helping them connect their actions to later results, good or bad.
Which leaves us with the optimal style then, which must be authoritative parenting. I've heard that term often cited as the gold standard.
It generally is, yes. This style is characterized by being high in both demandingness and responsiveness. Think of it as the tender teacher or firm but fair approach.
Okay.
Authoritative parents set clear, high expectations and boundaries, but they do so within a warm, supportive, and responsive environment. Crucially, they tend to use rule consequentialist framing. They explain the reasons behind rules, linking them to positive consequences for the child, the family, or others. We have this rule because it keeps everyone safe, or doing your chores helps the whole family.
And they let kids experience consequences.
Yes. Importantly, they use natural and logical consequences as teaching moments rather than purely punitive ones. If a child forgets their lunch, the natural consequence might be feeling hungry. The parent doesn't rush to school to fix it immediately, but discusses it later. They allow children to experience the outcomes of their choices within safe limits and then help them process it, asking questions like, what happened because of that choice? What could you do differently next time?
And I imagine it fosters empathy, too, teaching children to consider consequences for other people, not just themselves.
Absolutely. Through open communication, listening, and explaining the impact of behavior on others, they actively foster empathy and social responsibility. They're teaching children to broaden the scope of their consequence calculations beyond just what's in it for me.
And the results?
The evidence is overwhelming. This style consistently produces the best consequences in children. They tend to be happier, more capable, self-reliant, possess better self-discipline and emotional control, are more socially competent, and, crucially, they internalize sophisticated consequentialist reasoning. The best scenario involves creating a stable, loving environment where parents consciously model and teach this art of thinking about and managing consequences effectively.
Okay, let's zoom out again to the group level. You asked a really profound question earlier about why people sometimes tend to break the rules concerning their cultures and try to get rid of other cultures. It's a dark but persistent aspect of human history. How does the consequentialist systems model help us understand that?
It's a deeply disturbing question, but the model offers a powerful, if unsettling, explanation. It suggests this phenomenon is rooted in a fundamental limitation, or perhaps a distortion, in the scope of human moral calculation. We call it in-group, out-group bias.
Our tendency to favor us over them.
Exactly. We are inherently group-living species. Our identities, our sense of self, are deeply intertwined with the groups we belong to, our family, our community, our nation, our religion, whatever it may be. We derive self-esteem from our group's success, which naturally leads to in-group favoritism. We tend to treat members of our own group with preference, trust, and altruism.
That part sounds okay, helping your own, but then there's the flip side.
The flip side is out-group bias, yes. We tend to view those outside our designated in-group more negatively, often stereotyping them, viewing them as a monolithic block, well, they are all like that, and treating them with suspicion, distrust, or even outright hostility.
And from a consequentialist perspective, this is.
It's a critical moral failure, a collapse of impartiality. That core consequentialist principle we talked about, it breaks down. The moral community, the circle of beings whose consequences we care about, shrinks dramatically to encompass only the in-group.
So consequences for outsiders don't count?
They are heavily discounted, ignored, or sometimes chillingly. Negative consequences for the out-group are actually seen as positive outcomes if they benefit the in-group. This is what the study calls scoped consequentialism. The optimization algorithm that drive for good outcomes is running only for a limited subset of affected people.
So intergroup conflict like wars, ethnic cleansing, systemic discrimination is the predictable, horrifying result when different groups practice this kind of deeply scoped consequentialism.
Precisely. When groups each primarily focus on maximizing their own perceived outcomes, compete for scarce resources like land, power, status, it fuels a dangerous feedback loop. Competition breeds bias. Bias distorts moral reasoning about the outgroup, and that distorted reasoning then justifies aggression or discrimination.
The outgroup gets dehumanized.
Exactly. They're framed as immoral, dangerous, less than human, making actions against them seem not only permissible, but sometimes even necessary or righteous from the in-group's consequentialist perspective. The universal rules of the culture, things like basic human rights or norms of decency, are readily broken when they conflict with this perceived need for in-group optimization. Getting rid of other cultures becomes, in this tragically distorted logic, the ultimate consequentialist act to ensure the security, purity, or dominance of one's own group.
It's a sobering explanation. Now, as societies scale up even further, they develop these large, formal structures law, public policy, which seem like humanity's most explicit attempts at large-scale consequentialist engineering, trying to manage outcomes for millions.
They absolutely are.
Yeah.
You can view our entire legal system, particularly statutory law, as operating primarily through rule consequentialism. Most laws aren't arbitrary. They are general rules established precisely because lawmakers believe their widespread observance will produce the best overall societal consequences. Think about it. Traffic laws exist to minimize accidents and promote efficient transportation. Contract law provides predictability and reduces economic risk, promoting commerce and prosperity. Criminal law deters harmful actions and provides a framework for justice. The entire legal system is built on the fundamental belief that having clear, predictable rules leads to better aggregate outcomes for society than not having them.
But even within that rule-based system, there still seems to be an element of act consequentialism in how laws are applied, isn't there? Like in courtrooms.
Yes, there certainly is, especially in judicial decision-making. While the laws themselves are generally rule consequentialist, judges often have to apply them using a more act consequentialist reasoning process in specific, complex cases. They frequently use balancing tests.
Balancing tests.
Where they carefully weigh competing interests, rights, and the likely consequences of a particular ruling in that specific situation. The famous hand formula in U.S. tort law, for instance, used to determine negligence.
Right, I've heard of that.
It explicitly compares the cost of taking precautions to prevent an accident against the probability of the accident happening, multiplied by the magnitude of the potential loss if it does happen. It's a pure, almost mathematical example of calculating consequences on a case-by-case basis within the broader legal framework.
And public policy sounds like the active steering of this massive system, trying to nudge it towards better outcomes.
Exactly. Policymaking is explicitly the practice of designing interventions laws, regulations, programs, incentives specifically intended to achieve desirable societal consequences and avoid undesirable ones. Public health is a fantastic, clear example of applied utilitarianism or consequentialism in action.
How so?
Decisions about, say, mandatory vaccination campaigns, funding allocation for medical research, or lockdown measures during a pandemic are often based explicitly on maximizing health benefits for the greatest number of people, often using tools like cost-benefit analysis or quality-adjusted life years, QALYs, to weigh the consequences.
But interventions, especially big policy ones, can also have incredibly complex and unintended consequences, can't they? That's where it gets really tricky. You fix one problem, another pops up.
Which is precisely why systems thinking and policy design is absolutely crucial, and why it often fails when ignored. Remember our causal loops. A classic example is the tough-on-crime policy approach, focusing heavily on arrests and long prison sentences.
Sounds good initially. Get criminals off the street.
Right. It might reduce certain types of street crime in the short term, which looks like a positive consequence. But if it leads to mass incarceration, particularly in disadvantaged communities, well, that can destabilize families, remove parents, reduce future employment prospects for ex-offenders, and erode social capital. The unintended consequence. It can ultimately create a cycle of poverty, despair, and reoffending, potentially leading to more crime and social dysfunction in the long run.
A vicious cycle again.
Exactly. Effective policy needs to map these complex, interconnected relationships to identify high-leverage interventions that address root causes and, crucially, anticipate and mitigate potential negative ripple effects across the system.
So the schematic of human society, as this AI study describes it, is essentially this dynamic, multi-level system of interconnected, consequentialist calculations happening all the time at all scales. It's like a fractal pattern.
That's a perfect analogy the study uses. The same fundamental logic of weighing actions based on their expected outcomes repeats itself at every scale.
Yeah.
An individual deciding whether to cheat, an authoritative parent teaching a child to consider the family unit, a business leader weighing market impacts, a lawmaker deliberating on national consequences, an international body negotiating climate treaties. And a healthy society, from this perspective, is one where these lower-level calculations, individual, family, corporate, become increasingly aligned with the well-being of the whole system. This alignment happens primarily through effective education, teaching systems thinking and empathy, good governance, and institutions that foster an ever-expanding scope of impartiality, caring about consequences for more and more people.
And this model also gives us a more nuanced, maybe less judgmental understanding of something like common individual rule breaking, like why someone might cheat on their taxes or download copyrighted material. It's not just they're inherently bad people.
It's rarely simple irrationality or pure malice, no. From the individual's narrow act consequentialist perspective, the calculation often looks rational, if self-serving. The personal gain from, say, tax evasion is significant and certain to them. The negative consequence for society, however, is diffuse, spread across millions, and feels imperceptible to that one individual.
My little bit won't make a difference.
Exactly. My gain outweighs my tiny, almost invisible contribution to a distant public harm. It's a locally rational calculation. The action is a clear failure only from a broader rule consequentialist perspective, where the aggregate impact, if everyone did it, would be disastrous for public services and social trust.
So mitigating it requires more than just punishment.
Punishment, increasing the negative personal consequences, is part of it, sure, through enforcement, but it also requires fostering that broader systems-level understanding through education and civic culture of how individual actions aggregate into collective outcomes, making the societal harm feel more real and relevant to the individual chooser.
Okay, so looking to the future through this consequentialist lens, let's talk leadership. What would be the proper human culture, the right mindset to elect a leader in important government positions? How do we pick someone who can actually navigate this incredibly complex system effectively and ethically?
That's a crucial question for governance. The study argues that a culture truly grounded in a mature understanding of consequentialism would select leaders based primarily on their demonstrated competence in producing beneficial outcomes for the entire society, not just for their own party or base.
So less about charisma, more about competence and results.
Essentially, yes. The ideal leader, in this framework, is a skilled and ethical systems engineer. They need several key competencies. First, robust systems thinking ability, the capacity to grasp complex, dynamic cause and effect relationships and anticipate not just first-order, but second- and third-order consequences of policies.
Seeing the whole board, not just the next move. And what else? An expanded moral scope, presumably, beyond just their own narrow group or political party.
Absolutely vital. They need genuine impartiality, prioritizing the well-being of all citizens, including future generations and maybe even non-human interests, over narrow factional interests or historical biases. They need to constantly ask, what are the consequences for everyone affected?
That sounds like a tall order.
It is. They also need what's called epistemic humility,
Epistemic humility, meaning?
meaning they base decisions on the best available evidence and are open to being wrong, willing to update their beliefs and change course when the evidence suggests it, not rigidly clinging to a fixed ideology regardless of the real-world consequences. And finally, crucially, a long-term orientation, the ability and willingness to resist sacrificing long-term societal well-being or environmental sustainability for short-term political gains or economic benefits.
Thinking beyond the next election cycle.
Precisely. They need to be stewards for the future, considering intergenerational consequences.
A key part of good leadership, then, would also be designing ethical reward systems throughout society, wouldn't it? Aligning individual incentives with these broader collective goals.
That's absolutely crucial. It's a core function of effective governance from a consequentialist standpoint, aligning individual incentives with the collective good. This means using economic tools cleverly, things like carbon taxes or subsidies for renewable energy, to make sustainable and socially responsible behavior the profitable or easier choice for individuals and businesses.
And social incentives, too.
Yes, fostering a culture that grants status, respect, and recognition not just for accumulating private wealth, but for contributing significantly to the public good, to science, to art, to community well-being. But we also have to be incredibly careful to avoid designing perverse incentives.
Or incentives that backfire.
Exactly. Incentives that unintentionally reward harmful behavior. The infamous Wells Fargo account fraud scandal is a classic example. Aggressive sales quotas, intended to boost profits, created immense pressure on employees, leading to widespread unethical behavior, opening fake accounts with disastrous consequences for customers and the bank's reputation. The incentive system itself produced terrible consequences. Designing systems requires careful consequence analysis. And this consequentialist framework isn't just for domestic governance, right? It's absolutely essential for tackling the huge, pressing global challenges we face, like extreme poverty.
Yeah, extreme poverty feels like such a stark moral failure when you look at it from this global consequentialist perspective. All that immense preventable suffering. Especially when you consider the principle of diminishing marginal utility, meaning a dollar can do so much more good, create so much more well-being for someone in extreme poverty than it can for someone already affluent.
It's truly compelling, isn't it? Philosopher Peter Singer, a prominent consequentialist, makes a powerful argument based on this. He essentially says that if we can prevent something really bad from happening, like someone dying from lack of food or preventable disease, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we are morally obligated to do it.
So it transforms what we often casually think of as charity into something much stronger, a fundamental moral duty.
Exactly. If you can save a life by donating an amount of money that won't significantly impact your own well-being, the consequentialist calculation strongly suggests you should.
And effective altruism is a real-world example of people trying to live out that philosophy, isn't it? Systematically trying to figure out how to do the most good.
Yes, exactly. Effective altruism, or EA, is really the embodiment of applied global consequentialism. It's a movement and philosophy that uses data, evidence, and rigorous reasoning to figure out how to use limited resources, time, money, to help others the most effectively.
So it's not just about giving, but giving smartly.
Precisely. They prioritize interventions that are proven to be incredibly cost-effective, like distributing insecticide-treated bed nets to prevent malaria, or funding vitamin A supplementation programs. Why?
Yeah.
Because the evidence shows these interventions save or dramatically improve the most lives per dollar spent compared to many other charitable activities. EA is a deliberate, systematic, real-world attempt to solve the consequentialist calculation problem on a global scale.
And environmental sustainability is also a quintessential consequentialist challenge, maybe the challenge of our time, involving incredibly complex systems and long-term outcomes.
It absolutely is. It involves these incredibly complex causal chains, really long time horizons. Decisions made today impact generations far into the future, and difficult trade-offs between current economic activity and long-term environmental degradation.
How does consequentialism help navigate that?
A consequentialist approach demands that we explicitly weigh that potential long-term degradation, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion against the short-term costs of mitigation or adaptation. Importantly, the framework is flexible enough to be non-anthropocentric. We can include the well-being or intrinsic value of entire ecosystems, biodiversity, and animal welfare in our consequence calculations, not just narrow human comfort or economic output.
And AI, again, sounds like it could be an incredibly powerful tool for tackling that calculation problem, understanding those complex environmental systems.
Indeed. AI is rapidly becoming indispensable for this. It's used for modeling complex climate systems to make more accurate predictions, for real-time monitoring of deforestation or pollution using satellite imagery, for optimizing energy grids to integrate renewables efficiently, for designing more sustainable materials. AI tools are enabling more rational, consequence-aware decisions for the planet's future. And this brings us right back to the future, and where it gets truly profound, potentially transformative. This study argues that AI can finally help solve that practical impossibility problem that has historically plagued consequentialism for us limited humans. It can act as a powerful moral co-processor.
A moral coprocessor. So AI is a supercalculator, essentially, modeling these incredibly complex social and environmental systems, predicting myriad consequences with unprecedented speed and accuracy, making it the ultimate tool for applied consequentialism.
That's the potential, exactly. And this is a huge but, this immense power comes with equally profound risks that we absolutely must understand and manage. A major one we've touched on is the black box problem.
We don't always know how the AI reaches its conclusions.
Right. The internal decision-making processes of complex AI models can be opaque, even sometimes to their own creators. This lack of transparency is a huge problem for trust and accountability. That's why explainable AI, or XAI, isn't just a technical nicety, it's an ethical imperative. We need transparency to trust AI recommendations, especially in high-stakes domains, to hold systems accountable when they err, to detect hidden biases, and crucially, to ensure its complex calculations genuinely align with our intended human values.
And algorithmic bias is another huge immediate risk we need to wrestle with.
Absolutely. AI learns from the data it's trained on. If that data reflects existing societal biases, say historical inequalities in hiring practices, loan applications, or policing data, the AI will inevitably learn and often amplify those biases.
So it perpetuates injustice automatically.
Precisely. An AI trained on biased hiring data might systematically penalize resumes from women or minorities, even if programmed to be fair in a naive sense. A predictive policing algorithm trained on historically biased arrest data might disproportionately target minority neighborhoods, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a catastrophic consequentialist failure. The AI might be optimally achieving some narrow goal based on flawed data, but producing deeply harmful and unjust societal consequences.
There's also the very real, maybe even scarier threat of AI-driven manipulation, isn't there? Using AI's predictive power against us.
This is a profound ethical challenge, yes. AI can become incredibly adept at optimizing for consequences that benefit a specific entity, like a corporation seeking profit or a political campaign seeking votes, by subtly exploiting individuals' cognitive biases, emotional vulnerabilities, and personal data.
How might that look?
Imagine AI designed to personalize and spread disinformation with maximum impact, tailored to your psychological profile. Or AI subtly nudging election outcomes by micro-targeting voters with emotionally manipulative content. Or systems exploiting your online behavior to influence your purchasing decisions in ways you're not even aware of. This undermines human autonomy, our capacity for rational, informed choice, turning us from beneficiaries of technology into targets of optimized manipulation. The consequences for democracy and individual freedom could be devastating.
So the solution, it seems, is to apply a consequentialist framework to AI governance itself. We have to design AI systems and the regulations surrounding them to explicitly optimize for consequences we actually desire: human well-being, fairness, autonomy, security.
That's exactly the argument. We need consequence-oriented AI governance. That's why ethical AI principles like accountability are so key. They create a feedback loop where developers and deployers face negative consequences, legal, reputational, for harmful outcomes, incentivizing safer, more ethical design from the start.
And transparency, fairness.
Transparency via XAI allows us, regulators, users, the public, to verify that the AI's calculations align with our values and aren't producing biased results. Fairness principles aim to proactively prevent the amplification of historical injustices. Human oversight ensures that AI remains a tool under meaningful human control, not an autonomous agent pursuing potentially misaligned goals. Robustness requirements minimize the risk of catastrophic failures or unforeseen harmful consequences. And explicitly enshrining human well-being or similar concepts defines the ultimate positive consequence that AI development should aim to maximize. It's all about intentionally shaping the system to produce the future consequences we want to see.
So, to bring it all back to where we started this deep dive, The core thesis of this study, this moral operating system idea, is that human morality, from our deepest evolved intuitions in our genes, through our psychological biases, our social structures, our laws, and right up to our most advanced AI systems, is fundamentally at its core about consequences.
It really seems to be the deep logic, the underlying algorithm that has guided the evolution of life, the shaping of the human mind, the emergence of cooperative societies, and the design of our most complex institutions. It's like that fractal pattern we talked about, the same fundamental logic of weighing actions based on their expected outcomes, operating relentlessly at every scale of human organization.
And the persistent challenges we face, things like individual rule breaking, corruption, chronic intergroup conflict, environmental destruction, aren't necessarily failures of morality itself, but are often the predictable outcomes of consequentialist calculations that are simply too narrowly scoped, only considering the self or the in-group, too short-sighted, only considering immediate effects, or based on flawed information or distorted values.
That's a really important nuance. The system is working, but it's often optimizing for the wrong things, or over too limited a scope.
Which means humanity is really at a critical juncture, wouldn't you say? We're facing these massive, interconnected global challenges: climate change, pandemics, inequality, potential AI risks that our intuitive, often parochial, evolved moral frameworks are simply not robust enough to handle effectively on their own.
I believe so. The path forward, if we want to navigate these challenges and build a truly healthy, prosperous, and sustainable global society, seems to require a conscious, collective transition. A transition towards a more mature, more reflective, more globally aware, and frankly, probably an AI-augmented consequentialism.
And for you, our listener, thinking about how to contribute to this shift, the study suggests it boils down to maybe 3 key commitments, 3 ways of thinking and acting to help shape that better future. First, actively embracing systems thinking.
Yes, learning to see the world, our societies, our environment as deeply interconnected systems, making a real effort to anticipate not just the immediate obvious effects of actions and policies, but the second, third order consequences, the ripple effects, the feedback loops, moving beyond simple linear cause and effect.
Second, consciously working to expand the moral community.
This means actively fighting against our ingrained tendencies towards in-group favoritism and out-group bias. It means making a deliberate effort to consider and weigh the consequences of our actions and policies for all of humanity, including future generations who can't speak for themselves, and perhaps even extending that circle of concern to the broader biosphere, to other sentient beings that we share this planet with, diligently optimizing for a much wider scope of well-being.
And third, thoughtfully leveraging AI as that potential moral co-processor we discussed.
Harnessing its unprecedented power to help us model complex systems, understand intricate causal chains, and predict diverse outcomes far better than we can alone. But, and it's crucial, wielding this power with extreme caution, with humility, and governing it with a rigorous, consequence-oriented ethical framework that always prioritizes genuine human well-being, fairness, autonomy, and security above narrow profits or power.
So a final thought to leave you with.
The science of human morality, as this study compellingly argues, is demonstrably about consequences. The future of human morality, then, the kind of world we build, will ultimately be determined by our collective courage and wisdom in choosing which consequences we truly want to pursue and for whom we want to pursue them.
This is DigitView.